I stumbled across Anthony's videos and Reed's videos, and I immediately understood what they were trying to do, mostly because my background is that of a clinical psychologist.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, and so I really understood, like, okay,
Right.
this is kind of clinical psychology, but you're not helping an illness, you're not trying to correct a disorder in the sense, and it's not really directed towards an internal concept of who you are. It's more directed kind of an outward belief about the world. And it just kind of, the lens was different about it. And so, and you're not treating anything, but you're going on a journey to help a person understand the beliefs they have and kind of reality test them. And so I really like that.
Yeah, there's too many interesting things to talk about in there already. I suspected this was going to happen, was that we were going to end up getting into some interesting territory, but I didn't realize it was going to happen so soon. Look, I think that's really interesting. That one of the things that I think in some ways in the SE space is it almost needs to be careful not to be seen as clinical intervention, like a therapy intervention. And that's kind of a danger, I guess, in the space, because in some ways it kind of has those characteristics, and yet it's not really set up to manage that experience properly and deal with the consequences and repercussions of the experience. So I think that's definitely interesting to notice. But the other thing you made me think about there is like the idea that maybe are bad ideas akin to illnesses in some small way? Like if you hold a bad idea that's actually harmful to you, like the divide between you having a self-destructive personality trait, for example, and you being self-destructive as a result of holding a bad belief, like I'm not sure like how I don't know how much distance there is between those two concepts.
Yeah, so cognitive behavioral therapy kind of works on the concept that you have a person may have distorted beliefs about themselves, and these distorted beliefs sort of crop up and kind of color that person's experience, and sort of distorts the way they see the world, how they interact with people, and they can't kind of get beyond themselves that way. And one way cognitive does more than this, but one way cognitive behavioral therapy works is that it reality tests those beliefs one person has about themselves and say, well, is this really true? And let's and you assign the person homework and where they will go and do tests on themselves and see if how they're seeing themselves in their interactions with others is correct. And how it can be modified. But it's interesting where cognitive behavioral therapy diverges some is that SE is more, it's actually more important for an SE conversation to kind of at least try to land on the truth. I mean, the way I see it, kind of at least try to approximate it a little bit. And then with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not really, whether something is true or in an objective sense isn't as important as whether it's more functional for the person, which is kind of interesting.
You know, I've always been an atheist my whole life, but I read the God Delusion as a kind of to try to understand why this particular book was seen as so controversial as it certainly was at the time, and still is actually. And I was surprised to find that, you know, I did fear the book because obviously it was, in theory, attempting to convert people to a position I already held. So I wasn't apprehensive about it, but I was just curious about what was making people so angry. And I was really surprised to find that Richard Dawkins was such a beautiful writer for the first thing. That was the first thing I noticed. And the second thing I noticed was that despite the fact that I've been an atheist my whole life, the God Delusion actually introduced me to this idea that religion has still a huge influence on my life and the way in which my world is constructed, you know, even though I don't believe in it. And actually for the longest time we've had as atheists, we don't get a seat at the table in those conversations. I wouldn't say atheism is a belief. I think it's the not choosing to believe something else. I emancipated myself of the idea of Santa Claus, you know, that the world was also growing out of this other idea of God and the church and things. And that was fine. And that it would just be naturally sort of falling away into the background. And I think the God Delusion and then subsequently much of Christopher Hitchens' work, I think really inspired me to recognize that, you know, there are arguments being had today that relate to these issues. And then I started reading more philosophy, Bertrand Russell specifically, and a lot of other philosophy.
I probably have been an atheist my whole life, but never really thought about it,
Mm,
and I definitely really have never identified with it. It's just,
right,
it's just, yeah,
right.
it's just something, and we've talked about this before. It's like, and I know Sam Harris has a thing where he talks about someone who doesn't believe in astrology, and why would they identify themselves as a non-astrologer?
Right,
you know
exactly. Yes.
and I kind of think the same way, and I don't like, why would, I mean, to me it's just a, I identify with the concepts, but as far as holding that as an identity, it's just,
Hmm.
that is foreign to me. And so
Yeah.
when I read books, which it seems like this, like a manual for creating atheists, that I'm thinking that wouldn't, um for the similar reasons, that wouldn't, I probably wouldn't get through that book.
I think that's a remarkable. So, firstly, I think it's an expression of the null hypothesis, ultimately, isn't it? That by default, we don't believe in something we've never heard of or have no reason to believe in it. And then if people give us reasons to believe in something, we may become convinced and be sufficiently convinced that we end up saying that we believe this position.
Yeah.
But by default, we don't believe anything because we're not aware of it. So a child is born, a child is neither, I would say the child is an atheist in the sense that they do not believe in the theist. They're a non-theist, which is kind of how I view atheist. But you could say, well, the child has not made a decision about that yet. But I would say, well, therefore they don't believe, right? And anybody who doesn't believe, in my view, is an atheist.
You can spend your time talking about atheism, but to me, talking about concepts around, that form street epistemology, that seems so much getting more to the point, because
Right.
you could be an atheist for good reasons, and you could be an atheist for very poor reasons.
Absolutely.
And you can, I think people can assume, like, if you're an atheist, if you yourself is an atheist, you think, oh well, obviously they've thought this out and it's well-formed reasons why. But maybe you're an atheist because your neighbor is an atheist. I mean, who knows?
Right.
And so it's more not that, it's more getting to the reasons why.
Right.
And so that, I think, really reflects why, I think, focusing more on a street epistemological or an epistemological perspective. And the criticism that street epistemology, one of them it gets, is that it has its roots in atheism, which it does, because of the Manual to Create Atheists, and Peter Boghossian, who also wrote the next
How
book,
to have impossible conversations.
Conversations, which I really hadn't read until last year.
Oh,
and
wow.
then,
What did you think to it? Sorry. What did you think?
Yeah, well, I wish I had read it sooner, just because I learn the same way you do, and I'm much better like looking at people doing something than I'm going to do it.
Right.
And it probably would have helped if I read more concepts-driven stuff. But
did you get the hints? I definitely got the hints. Sorry, this is a sidetrack. But did you get the hints that I got? I definitely feel like they were making a deliberate attempt, or Peter Boghossian was making a deliberate attempt to write a less contentious and unnecessarily bogged down in sort of rhetoric book. But I still felt like it was being surfaced quite a lot in that book. And I also got a sense of why the community is so confused about the objectives of street epistemology, because even in that book, like there was an anecdote where he describes standing in the line of a restaurant with his wife, I think, and he was expressing that he had this sort of hobby where he would try and talk people out of supporting their favorite teams. And I just thought that's exactly the kind of Jedi mind trickery stuff that we really can't and shouldn't be associated with. If it's just a way of just confusing people into not liking the things that they like, or it's a method of changing people's views, that's not something I feel like you can support. And I felt like even in How to Have Impossible Conversations, that story was in there that made me think it just hasn't sufficiently moved away, I think, from those troubling overtones.
Yeah, and yes, I see where you're coming from, and I think part of it is, I think probably when he wrote the book, I don't think he realized where we'd be now with kind of the street epistemology. I don't know if it's a movement but
I think so.
Yeah. And it's sort of become the new atheism, in the sense that, that that's how I see it. I don't know.
Sure.
Do you see it?
I don't really think I think it, yeah, I understand why it gets wrapped up with atheism still, because like the argument would have to be, if there is a truly rational reason to hold a religious view, then street epistemology would be just as good at convincing you that religion was true as it would be to convince you that no religion is true. If we had the same level of evidence for the divinity of the divinity of Jesus, as we do for the existence of the dinosaurs, I would be a Christian. That's pretty damn good evidence, I would say. But we don't have anything like that, and I think those claims are, on the face of them, equally extraordinary. Like the idea that this world was filled with Godzilla type things is crazy, and yet we have massive amounts of evidence to believe. Christopher Hitchens used to criticize the concept of faith being an a priori good thing, like in society, especially in America. Like, the being a person of faith demands respect immediately, and it's a way of sort of shortcutting the respect amongst people. But faith is, he was a big advocate of saying, no, faith is to be mocked and ridiculed. It's believing things without having a reason to believe them. This is silly. And there is still this idea that faith in and of itself is a good thing. It's a virtue. It's seen in many places. And that's really alarming, I think. I think faith is not a good, by definition, is not a good reason to believe in something. It's the absence of good reasons. If you had good reasons, you wouldn't need to believe it on faith. And yet we have that virtue. And it's alarming to me that it's still so prevalent, I think.
And I think it's interesting. And then when SE, I'm sort of attuned to SE criticisms. Another criticism that SE gets is that when we talk about faith, we're not talking about faith in the way other people are talking about faith. The way we talk about faith is in the sense of knowing something that we don't know, or knowing something that there's a lack of evidence for that thing to be known. And then we're not talking about faith the way other people are talking about faith, maybe in terms of trust or hope or those kinds of things. I just think that's interesting.
And I've often described this idea, like, when I hear people talk about theology at a highly detailed level, it sounds so similar to me to people talking about Dungeons and Dragons. When I've heard my friends talk about, just ad nauseum sometimes, the nuance of the rule set and the complexity and the history and the lore of some nuanced Dungeons and Dragons rule, and within the world, within the construct, within that
world, yes.
There's totally logically consistent, and so they can, from this one assumption that this world is true, they can construct all these kinds of real rational logical arguments within that framework. But obviously this is deliberately a very different world that they're talking about. Yeah, there was a thing we were talking about recently, which is this idea that atheists, I think, by their nature, have become very skeptical of organized groups around ideologies, right? And I think that's probably very true, that we're not very good at coming together. And famously, it's been spoken about, like trying to herd cats is just how you gathering atheists into a cohesive movement. But in any case, I continue to enjoy being part of the community. And Mark, it's been an absolute joy talking to you today. So
you too, Will.
Thank you so much for your time, man. And yeah, to be continued, I'm sure.